On a quiet winter day in Boston, in January of 1919, the air was cold and still. Children were playing near the harbor. Horses pulled wagons through narrow streets, and from a massive steel tank overlooking the neighborhood came a low, uneasy groan. Moments later, the sound became a roar. Without warning, 2.5 million gallons of thick, dark molasses burst free. A wave 15 feet high rushed down the streets at more than 30 miles per hour. It crushed buildings, swept away people and animals, and twisted steel beams like paper. When it was over, the city's north end looked as if a war had passed through. 21 people were dead. More than 150 were injured. And for decades afterward, locals would say that on hot summer days, the streets of Boston still smelled faintly of molasses. This is the story of how it happened, how an everyday industrial product, stored in haste and ignored in warning, turned into one of America's strangest disasters. A story of negligence, chaos, and resilience. A story that was almost forgotten beneath a layer of sweetness. In the early days of 1919, Boston stood at the crossroads of 2 centuries. The world had just emerged from the Great War, and America was finding its new rhythm, industrial, confident, and restless. The harbor city, once known for its scholars and revolutionaries, now thrummed with the sounds of machinery, ship horns, and the constant movement of goods. Along the waterfront, in the crowded district known as the North End, a strange, sweet scent hung in the air. It came from the Purity Distilling Company, a local branch of the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Corporation, which stored thousands of gallons of molasses in an enormous steel tank near the docks. The smell was familiar to everyone who lived nearby. To children, it was pleasant, almost comforting. To the adults who worked around it, it was just another sign of Boston's industry, another part of daily life. Molasses was not just for candy or baking. By 1919, it had become an important part of the American economy. It was used to make rum and industrial alcohol, both of which were in high demand after the war. In just a few months, prohibition would take effect, making the legal production of alcohol impossible. Companies rushed to store as much as they could before the new laws arrived. Speed mattered more than safety. The Purity Distilling Company's tank was built quickly, too quickly. It rose high above the neighborhood like a monument to progress, 50 feet tall, 90 feet across, and made of thin sheets of steel, held together by hundreds of rivets. The tank was so large it could hold more than 2 million gallons of molasses, enough to fill an entire city block. But from the very beginning, something wasn't right. When the wind blew, the structure creaked. When it was filled, the seams leaked. Local residents joked that children could bring pails and fill them with the molasses that dripped from its sides. Workers knew the tank groaned at night, a low metallic complaint that echoed across the harbor. The company painted the metal dark brown to hide the leaks. To most people, though, it was just background noise, another part of a city already full of strange sounds and smells. The North End was one of the most densely populated areas in Boston, home to thousands of Italian immigrants who lived in narrow, brick apartment buildings pressed close together. Street vendors shouted in 2 languages. Laundry hung between windows like flags. And in the distance, beyond the clatter of trains and the cry of gulls, the molasses tank stood still, glistening in the cold winter light. No one expected what was coming. The tank had stood for nearly 4 years, through hot summers and freezing winters, without collapsing. It was, people assumed, strong enough. But inside its steel walls, stress had been building quietly, invisibly with every new shipment that arrived from the Caribbean. By mid-January 1919, the tank was filled almost to the top with fresh, warm molasses delivered from the southern islands. Outside, the temperature hovered just below freezing. The difference between the warm liquid inside and the cold winter air outside created enormous pressure on the thin steel walls. Still, life went on as usual. Workers walked past it. Children played nearby. The residents of the North End went about their daily routines, unaware that within hours, this familiar tank, this harmless symbol of industry, would turn into a force powerful enough to tear through their streets. At the dawn of the 20th century, Boston was a city caught between old and new worlds. The proud cradle of the American Revolution had become a dense industrial hub filled with factories, warehouses, and smoke rising from chimneys that lined the harbor. Steamships came and went, carrying raw materials, coal, and sugar from distant ports. The waterfront was the heartbeat of the city's economy, noisy, crowded, and alive with movement. The North End was one of Boston's oldest neighborhoods, and by 1919, it had transformed into a maze of narrow streets packed with tenement buildings. The grand homes of the 18th century had long been divided into small apartments, each filled with large immigrant families. Most were Italians who had arrived in the late 1800s seeking work and a better life. They brought their traditions, their food, and their language, and created a community within the city's rough industrial shell. Life here was not easy. Men worked long hours on the docks or in nearby factories. Women often took in laundry or sewing to earn extra money. Children roamed the cobblestone streets, playing between wagons and rail lines. The neighborhood was alive with voices street vendors calling in Italian, church bells ringing from street lanterns, and the hum of trains running overhead. Despite the poverty, there was warmth and resilience. Neighbors knew one another. Families helped each other through long winters and uncertain paydays. Above this close-knit community loomed the structures of industry, rail lines, warehouses, and, eventually, the massive molasses tank on Commercial Street. The tank stood near the harbor's edge, beside a small playground and a firehouse. For many local children, it was a landmark, something to climb near, to point out to visitors, a giant symbol of the working port. Few understood what it contained, or the risks it posed. Boston itself was changing rapidly. The city's government was struggling to modernize infrastructure. Streets were still uneven and narrow, horse-drawn carts often mixed with the new automobiles. Electric streetcars ran through downtown, but in places like the North End, time seemed to move slower. Factories and warehouses dominated the waterfront. Their owners focused on profit and production more than on safety or maintenance. The Great War had accelerated everything. During those years, the demand for industrial alcohol had soared. It was used not only for drinks, but for munitions, medical supplies, and fuel additives. Companies like the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Corporation had become powerful and wealthy almost overnight. Their facilities were pushed to their limits, and the pace of work left little room for oversight. Regulations were minimal. Engineering standards were often left to the judgment of whoever built the structures. It was in this atmosphere of progress and pressure that the Purity Distilling Company constructed its enormous storage tank in 1915. The project was rushed to meet wartime demand. There was no proper inspection before it was put into use. No safety tests were conducted. The company simply began filling it and hoped for the best. For the residents of the North End, it was just another industrial addition to their already crowded neighborhood. They had lived beside coal yards, distilleries, and freight depots before. A giant tank of molasses didn't seem unusual. What mattered was work, rent, and family, the simple routines of survival in a city built on constant change. Looking back, it is easy to see the signs. A neighborhood of hardworking families living under the shadow of a corporate shortcut. But in January 1919, no one in Boston imagined that a tank of syrup, a symbol of sweet, steady industry, could become a deadly force. The city was moving forward, proud of its progress, unaware of how fragile that progress really was. The story of the Great Tank began not with malice, but with haste. In 1915, as World War I raged overseas, American industry worked at a feverish pace to meet growing demands. The U.S. Industrial Alcohol Corporation, known as USIA, supplied alcohol for a variety of purposes: munitions, fuels, and industrial chemicals. Its subsidiary, the Purity Distilling Company, handled much of the raw molasses that arrived by ship from the Caribbean. Molasses was a cheap, plentiful source of fermentable sugar, the starting point for alcohol production. And Boston, with its busy harbor and rail connections, was a perfect hub for storage and distribution. But the company faced a problem. The existing facilities were too small. Large shipments of molasses arrived from Cuba and Puerto Rico faster than they could be processed. To keep up, Purity Distilling needed a new storage tank big enough to hold entire shiploads at once. The order came quickly from corporate headquarters: build it as soon as possible. The man responsible for its construction was Arthur Gell, a company manager with little engineering experience. He was not a trained architect or metallurgist. His expertise lay in logistics, not structural design. Yet, under pressure to deliver, he oversaw the project from start to finish. No detailed blueprints have ever been found. What is known is that the tank went up in just a few months, a rush job on land leased from the city near the waterfront rail yard. The tank itself was enormous, 90 feet in diameter, 50 feet tall. Its steel plates were riveted together in vertical bands, like a giant barrel turned on its side. When empty, it weighed over 2.3 million pounds. When full, it held more than 2 million gallons of molasses, a mass that exerted nearly 14,000 tons of pressure on its base. To save money, the steel plates were thinner than recommended for a vessel of that size, and none of the joints were reinforced from the inside. From the very beginning, problems appeared. As soon as the tank was filled for the first time, workers noticed leaks. Rivulets of sticky brown syrup trickled down the seams, pooling at the base. Children in the neighborhood collected the molasses in tin cups. When workers reported the leaks, Gell ordered the tank painted dark brown to hide them. He insisted the structure was sound. He said the molasses was simply seeping through imperfections that would seal themselves once the liquid cooled. There were more warning signs. When the tank was filled, it groaned loudly, a deep, metallic rumble that echoed across the harbor. Nearby residents heard it and joked that it sounded like a ship in distress. No one took it seriously. After all, the tank stood year after year, holding its dark cargo. It became part of the scenery, an accepted landmark between the harbor and the narrow streets of the North End, Inside the company, a culture of denial persisted. Molasses shipments were essential to business, and delays were costly. The tank was refilled again and again, sometimes almost to the brim, with no formal inspection ever performed. There were no city safety codes requiring one, and no government agency responsible for oversight. It was a time before industrial accountability, a time when trust in private enterprise was assumed to be enough. To an engineer's eye, the flaws were fatal. The steel used for the tank contained too little manganese, making it brittle in cold weather. The rivets that held the plates together were unevenly driven, leaving microscopic cracks that spread under stress. Every filling cycle increased the internal pressure and deepened the fractures. The tank was a giant pressure vessel waiting for the right combination of temperature and load to fail. In early January of 1919, that moment was approaching. Fresh molasses arrived from the Caribbean, warm and heavy, pumped into the already weakened tank. As the dark liquid rose higher inside, the metal walls flexed and creaked. Outside, the air was cold, thick with the scent of sugar and salt. No alarms were sounded. No inspections were made. The tank stood silent for a few more days, its surface calm, its danger invisible. By the winter of 1918, the molasses tank had become an accepted part of the North End skyline. It rose above the docks and warehouses like a strange industrial monument, a round, steel mountain that glinted in the sunlight and cast long shadows over the harbor. People walked past it every day without much thought. It was simply there, familiar, immovable. But to those who worked nearby, the tank was far from ordinary. It groaned. It leaked. It wept dark syrup through its seams so regularly that workers stopped being surprised. One longshoreman later recalled hearing a rumbling like thunder from inside the tank whenever it was filled. Another said he could see the steel plates quiver under the pressure, as though the structure itself was breathing. Children loved the leaks. They called it the molasses tank long before the newspapers did. They came with pails and sticks to scoop up the sticky drips from the base. In summer, the air around the site was sweet and heavy, thick enough to make flies swarm. In winter, the molasses hardened into glossy black patches along the ground. It was part of the neighborhood's rhythm, a harmless curiosity that no one believed could cause harm. Workers at the Purity distilling site felt differently. Some worried that the groans and leaks meant trouble. When they reported the noises to their supervisor, they were told it was nothing to worry about, that the molasses always made sounds when it settled. No inspection followed. The company's focus was on production. Each day, tankers unloaded new shipments of molasses from ships arriving from Havana and San Juan. The syrup was warm when it arrived, almost steaming as it poured through the pipes and into the tank. Once inside, it began to cool, thickening and expanding as its temperature dropped. The pressure inside the tank grew silently, pressing outward against the thin steel shell. One employee, Isaac Gonzalez, recalled that just days before the disaster, the tank had started to emit a strange metallic popping sound, as though it were straining. He warned his superiors that something was wrong. The response was simple. "It's fine. It's always done that." No one wanted to stop operations, not with another ship due in, and prohibition just weeks away. Every gallon of molasses meant profit, and every delay meant loss. Even the Boston police officers stationed nearby had noticed the leaks. Their horses would sometimes get their hooves stuck in the sticky residue that oozed across the ground. Residents complained about the mess, but not about the danger. To them, Molasses was messy, not deadly. In early January, a new shipment of molasses arrived from the Caribbean. The liquid had been transported in the warmth of the tropics and was still hot when it was pumped into the tank. The mixture of warm molasses meeting cold winter air made the steel groan more loudly than usual. The tank had been filled to near capacity, more than it had ever held before. The seams, already weakened by years of stress and small cracks, now faced their greatest test. On the morning of January 15, the sound of creaking metal echoed faintly across the waterfront. Some dock workers paused and looked toward the tank, but then went back to their tasks. A few hours later, a delivery driver passing by noticed small dark streaks running down the side of the structure. He thought it looked like sweat, as if the tank itself was sweating molasses. No one took action. The leaks were so common that they no longer drew attention. Inside the offices of the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company, there was no concern. The structure had stood for nearly 4 years. To the managers, that was proof enough of its strength. No one ordered an engineer to inspect it. No one checked the rivets or the welds. The tank was, officially, fine. By that afternoon, the molasses inside had reached its maximum volume. Warm liquid pressed against cold steel, and the metal plates vibrated with invisible strain. To anyone nearby, it was just another day in the North End, the sound of seagulls, the clatter of carts, the hum of city life. Yet beneath that normal rhythm, a massive structure was weakening second by second. The tank was alive with pressure, its rivets trembling, its walls bowing ever so slightly outward. All it needed was one small fracture, one moment of failure for the entire structure to come apart. The morning of January 15th began like any other in Boston's North End. The air was cold but clear, the kind of winter day when the sky seems pale and endless. A thin layer of frost covered the cobblestones along Commercial Street. Smoke rose from chimneys, curling slowly upward into the still air. Dock workers arrived early, their breath visible in the cold as they moved between warehouses and freight yards. Streetcars rattled along the tracks, carrying commuters toward downtown. Horses pulled wagons loaded with barrels and coal sacks. The city was alive, but quietly so the ordinary rhythm of a weekday morning after years of war and hardship. At the waterfront, the Great Molasses tank stood silent and full. Its dark steel shell glistened faintly under the weak winter sun. Inside, 2.5 million gallons of molasses sat under immense pressure, warm liquid, pushing outward against cold, brittle metal. From a distance, the tank looked solid, permanent, almost serene. Up close, it told a different story. A few men working nearby heard faint, metallic sounds coming from inside. To them, it was nothing new. The tank always made noise when it was full. But that morning, the tone was different, sharper, more strained. One worker later recalled hearing what he described as a growl, low and heavy, like a beast turning in its sleep. Inside the adjacent firehouse, Engine Company 31 was finishing its morning routines. Captain John Cahill was reviewing maintenance records while a few men cleaned equipment. Their station sat just a few yards from the base of the molasses tank, its upper windows looking directly out toward the curved steel wall. They had grown used to it, to the occasional creaks and drips, to the sweet smell that clung to everything nearby. No one imagined that within minutes, the tank would be gone. Elsewhere on Commercial Street, children from the neighborhood were playing near the freight tracks. One of them, 10-year-old Pasquale Iantosca, watched the horses as they hauled wagons past the massive tank. He and his friends liked to chase the carts, sometimes sneaking up to the tank to touch its sticky sides. That morning, they stayed close to the tracks, their laughter echoing against the buildings. Around midday, the temperature began to rise slightly, just a few degrees, but enough to loosen the molasses inside the tank. As it warmed, the liquid expanded, pushing harder against the steel walls. The sound of groaning metal grew louder, but still no one paid attention. It blended with the other noises of the harbor, the screech of train wheels, the slam of doors, the hum of engines. At 12:30 p.m., a delivery truck from Purity Distilling stopped near the tank. The driver, Patrick Breen, waited for instructions before unloading cargo. He noticed a thin stream of molasses leaking from one of the seams, slowly tracing a dark line down to the ground. He made a note to mention it to the foreman later. For now, it seemed harmless, just another leak. Inside the company's small office nearby, clerks were sorting papers, their fingers sticky from handling receipts and samples. They could hear the occasional creak from outside, but no one looked up from their work. The office clock ticked quietly. The harbor was calm. Nothing about the day suggested that anything extraordinary was about to happen. At 12:40, the sound changed. Those standing near the tank would later describe it as a rapid series of metallic snaps like gunfire echoing across the yard. Then, for a brief moment, there was silence. A silence so sudden it made people turn their heads. And then came the roar. But that belongs to the next chapter. At 12:41 inches the afternoon, the molasses tank gave way. There was no single explosion, no flash of fire, only a sudden, overwhelming release of pressure. The sound began as a deep rumble, low enough to vibrate in the chest. Then came a sharp metallic crack, like the tearing of a great sheet of steel. In seconds, the entire structure split apart. Witnesses later described the noise as a roar, something between thunder and cannon fire. The top of the tank lifted slightly before collapsing inward. The walls burst outward in a single, violent motion. A rush of dark liquid surged into the open air, transforming instantly from stillness into chaos. 2.5 million gallons of molasses, more than 13,000 tons of it, erupted from the broken shell. The wave rose 15 feet high, dense and glistening, moving faster than any human could run. It rolled through the yard like a living thing, sweeping up beams, barrels, and chunks of twisted metal. The tank's heavy steel plates flew through the air, cutting through nearby buildings like knives. The first to be struck was the elevated train trestle that ran along Commercial Street. The molasses slammed into its steel supports, bending them as if they were made of wire. An entire section of track collapsed, taking a passing freight car with it. The sound of grinding metal mixed with the muffled roar of the flood. Witnesses said the ground itself seemed to shake. At the nearby firehouse, Captain Cahill and his men heard the roar before they saw anything. They turned toward the windows, just as the dark wall hit. The entire front of the station was ripped away. Within moments, the building's upper floor collapsed, trapping the men beneath splintered beams and sticky debris. One of them managed to survive by floating on a piece of wreckage as the molasses poured through the streets. Outside, horses screamed as the wave overtook them. Wagons were lifted and smashed against walls. A delivery truck was tossed into the air and crushed against a telegraph pole. The flood moved at more than 30 miles per hour, fast enough to demolish wooden houses and flatten fences, slow enough that its victims could see it coming and still not escape. People tried to run, but molasses is thicker than water. It clings, it pulls. Those caught in it described the feeling as drowning in glue, impossible to breathe, impossible to move. The cold air turned the liquid even thicker, trapping everything it touched. When rescuers later arrived, they said the silence that followed was worse than the noise, a heavy, syrupy stillness broken only by the distant hiss of steam and the groaning of collapsing walls. Across the street, workers in the city's maintenance yard felt the shockwave. Windows shattered, doors blew open, and the air filled with the scent of sugar and iron. A steel fragment from the tank weighing several tons was thrown hundreds of feet through the air, slicing through buildings before landing on the waterfront. In less than a minute, the entire North End block was transformed. Where moments before there had been warehouses, a firehouse, and quiet streets, there was now only wreckage, a landscape of debris half buried in dark, viscous liquid. Steam rose where the warm molasses met the cold January air, creating a mist that settled over the ruins. The flood spread outward, seeping into basements, filling alleys, and pooling at the edges of the harbor. Then, as suddenly as it began, the movement slowed. The wave lost its force. The liquid began to settle, cooling and thickening as it spread. Within minutes, the disaster was complete. Boston had never seen anything like it. In that brief span of time, the city's normal rhythm, the hum of industry, the chatter of the docks, had been replaced by an eerie silence. All that remained was the smell, heavy, sweet, unmistakable. The air itself seemed to taste of sugar and rust. The first minutes after the rupture were filled with confusion. No one understood what had happened. Some thought a bomb had exploded. Others believed a gas main had burst. The war was still fresh in people's minds, and the noise had sounded like artillery fire. But when the dust and steam began to clear, it was not smoke or fire they saw. It was a dark, moving mass, thick and glistening, crawling through the streets. The flood did not behave like water. It did not splash or ripple. It moved with weight, rolling slowly but irresistibly forward. Those who had been close to the tank were gone within seconds, swept under or pinned against walls by the pressure of the wave. Others, farther away, saw the molasses coming and tried to flee. They found that running was nearly impossible. Each step pulled at their boots, as though the ground itself were trying to hold them in place. Eyewitnesses later said it looked like a wave of mud, but darker, almost black, reflecting light only in patches. It carried pieces of wood, metal, glass, and the bodies of horses. A few people were visible in it, struggling, shouting, their movements slow and helpless, as if trapped in a nightmare. At the firehouse, the upper floor had collapsed entirely. Several firefighters were buried beneath the wreckage, pinned by heavy beams and soaked in molasses. The men who survived called out to one another through the darkness, their voices muffled by the thick syrup. Outside, the street was unrecognizable. The nearby railway trestle lay twisted on the ground, its iron supports bent like reeds. The freight car that had been passing overhead now rested upside down in the middle of Commercial Street. For a few minutes, everything was still. The great wave had spent its force, spreading outward until it filled the low areas of the neighborhood. Then, slowly, sound returned. The moan of injured horses, the cries of people calling for help, the faint ringing of an alarm bell from beneath the rubble of the fire station. A group of sailors from a nearby Navy vessel was among the first to respond. They rushed toward the site, wading into the sticky mass without understanding what it was. every step was a struggle, the molasses clung to their legs, pulling at their boots. When they tried to lift the injured, the syrup pulled back, sucking at their arms. The rescuers found it impossible to move quickly. The scene was silent except for the labored breathing of those who were trapped and the creaking of broken wood. Neighbors began to appear at the edges of the disaster. Men and women stood in shock, staring at what had once been familiar streets. Some called out for loved ones who worked at the distillery or in nearby shops. Others searched for animals or possessions. Many simply stood still, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. In some areas, the molasses was several feet deep. It filled basements and cellars, poured through open doors, and pressed against windows. When rescuers tried to cut through debris, their tools became coated and useless. The cold January air turned the surface of the syrup into a sticky crust, while beneath it, the liquid remained warm and fluid. Every movement broke through that crust with a wet, sucking sound. The air was thick with the scent of sugar and iron. Steam still rose from the ground, mingling with the cold mist that drifted from the harbor. People spoke quietly, their voices dulled by the stillness that followed the chaos. Even the birds seemed to have vanished. Hours would pass before anyone truly understood the scale of what had happened. For now, there was only the scene before them, a neighborhood drowned in molasses. Horses motionless, wagons overturned, and the outlines of buildings half buried in the dark syrup. The once busy North End was silent, its sounds replaced by the slow drip of molasses sliding down the walls. In the minutes after the tank collapsed, word of the disaster spread unevenly through the city. At first, no one understood what had happened. The telephones at police headquarters rang with reports of an explosion on the waterfront. Some callers said a factory had blown up. Others claimed the elevated railway had collapsed. Few could describe the strange brown tide moving through the North End. Within 20 minutes, the first rescuers arrived: police officers, firefighters from other stations, and sailors from nearby Navy ships. They ran toward the site, expecting to find fire or rubble. Instead, they found a neighborhood drowning in syrup. The ground was covered in a thick, sticky mass that reached their knees. Each step was a struggle. The molasses clung to their boots, pulling them down. When they tried to lift a foot, it made a wet, sucking sound, as if the earth itself resisted their movement. They quickly realized that ordinary rescue work, running, digging, carrying, was almost impossible here. The first cries they heard came from the collapsed firehouse. The roof had caved in, trapping several men beneath the wreckage. Only the upper part of the station's wall was still standing, tilting dangerously toward the street. Firefighters from nearby stations waded in, using ladders as makeshift bridges to reach their comrades. They formed a line, passing broken boards and debris hand to hand. Each piece was coated with syrup, heavy and slick. Their gloves became soaked, their coats stiffened in the cold. They found Captain John Cahill alive, pinned beneath a beam. He was covered almost entirely in molasses, unable to move or speak above a whisper. It took nearly an hour to free him. 2 of his men were already dead. Others were pulled out half-conscious, their faces pale and glistening under the thick brown coating. The rescuers worked in near silence. The usual noise of the city carriages, shouts, machinery had stopped. Even the air seemed muffled, the sweet smell overwhelming. The only sounds were the groans of the injured and the slow movement of the rescuers through the syrup. Civilians joined in wherever they could. Neighbors brought buckets of hot water to thin the molasses, hoping it would help. It didn't. The syrup was too thick, too cold. The water only mixed with it, creating a sticky foam. Some men used planks and doors as platforms, laying them on the surface to avoid sinking. Others tried ropes, pulling trapped victims free by sheer force. Every rescue was a slow, exhausting fight. As night fell, the scene took on an otherworldly stillness. Gas lamps and lanterns flickered in the mist, reflecting off the dark surface of the molasses. The cold air turned the top layer solid again, while underneath it remained fluid, a trap for anyone who stepped too hard. Sailors from the USS Nantucket brought in stretchers and blankets. Police blocked the area, but people kept coming, drawn by curiosity and disbelief. At the edge of the disaster zone, families waited for news. They stood silently, bundled in coats, watching the dim lights move in the distance. Some called out names, their voices echoing across the sticky field. The rescuers called back when they found someone, though most of what they found were bodies unrecognizable, coated in dark syrup. By midnight, more than 100 rescuers were on site. Ambulances carried the injured to nearby hospitals. Doctors worked by lantern light, cutting away clothing hardened by molasses. They treated fractures, bruises, hypothermia, and exhaustion. Many victims could not be identified until the following days. As the temperature dropped, the work grew harder. The molasses thickened, turning from liquid to tar. Every step required force. Every movement slowed. By dawn, the rescuers were covered from head to toe, their uniforms stiff and blackened. Some said they could no longer smell anything but sugar. When the sun rose over Boston Harbor, it revealed the full extent of the destruction. A neighborhood flattened, tracks twisted, houses broken open, the streets glistening like amber under the pale light. The wave was gone, but its presence was everywhere in the air, on the walls, and in the silence that followed. By the morning of January 16th, Boston began to understand the scale of what had happened. The floodwaters had stopped moving, but the destruction they left behind stretched for blocks. Commercial Street was unrecognizable, a landscape of wreckage and silence. The ground was still covered in dark, sticky residue that clung to everything it touched. Every step made a faint cracking sound as the hardened surface gave way underfoot. Rescue crews worked methodically, searching through the remains of buildings and rail lines. They used shovels and axes to cut through debris that had turned to stone overnight. Each piece they lifted revealed another layer of ruin: a wagon crushed against a wall, a door splintered beyond recognition, a shape beneath the surface that might be human or animal. The work was slow, patient, and grim. The final count would take days, but by the end of the week, the numbers were clear. 21 people were dead. At least 150 were injured. Dozens of horses and other animals had been killed. Many of the victims were workers from the nearby railroad yard or children who had been playing in the street. Others were simply bystanders caught in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Among the dead were firefighters from Engine Company 31, warehouse workers, teamsters, and residents of the tenements nearby. Some had been trapped in their homes as the molasses burst through the walls. Others had been swept away entirely, their bodies carried hundreds of feet before coming to rest beneath the cooling syrup. For many, identification was difficult. The thick coating made features unrecognizable, and some victims were found only after days of digging. The damage to property was immense. The entire section of the elevated railway had collapsed. 2 city buildings were destroyed. Dozens of homes and businesses were gone. telegraph poles lay scattered like matchsticks. The estimated cost of the disaster exceeded $1 million, an enormous sum at the time. But beyond the numbers, there was the atmosphere, a sense of disbelief that hung over the city. Crowds gathered at the edges of the disaster zone, standing silently behind police lines. Reporters arrived with cameras, stepping carefully across planks laid over the hardened molasses. Their photographs showed streets that looked more like a battlefield than a neighborhood. Wreckage half buried in syrup, men in rubber boots wading through knee-deep pools of brown. Headlines called it the Boston Molasses Disaster, and the name stuck. The smell was everywhere. It filled the air, thick and sweet, clinging to clothing, to tools, to the skin of the rescuers. Even those who lived miles away claimed they could smell molasses on the wind. For weeks, the odor lingered in homes and offices, mixed with the cold salt air from the harbor. Some said they could taste it in their food. Others said it made them sick. When the bodies were finally recovered, they were taken to a temporary morgue at the city's pier. Families arrived in silence to identify their loved ones. Many could not bear to look. The city provided funerals, and local churches held services for the victims. The bells of street Leonards tolled through the narrow streets of the North End, echoing over the site of the tank. As the cleanup continued, the survivors tried to return to their routines, but nothing felt ordinary. The once busy neighborhood had been replaced by a wasteland of drying syrup and broken wood. Everywhere one looked, there were traces of molasses on walls, on rooftops, even on the harbor water, where it floated like a thin, brown film. When the tide went out, it left a sticky residue along the shore. For weeks afterward, city workers, soldiers, and volunteers labored to clear the mess. They shoveled debris, sprayed salt water from fireboats, and scraped molasses from the pavement. It stuck to everything, to tools, to horses, to the soles of their boots. Each night, they returned home exhausted, carrying the scent with them. Boston, for a time, smelled of sugar. Cleaning up after the Great Molasses Flood was not the work of days or weeks, it was the work of months. The scale of the disaster was unlike anything the city had faced before. Boston's North End, already a maze of narrow streets and aging buildings, had been turned into a sticky, glistening ruin. The molasses had seeped into every crevice, cellars, doorways, cracks between cobblestones, and it refused to go away. At first, the city tried ordinary methods. Firefighters brought out hoses, spraying water over the streets to wash the syrup into the harbor. It didn't work. Cold water only made the molasses thicker, harder to move. The surface solidified, trapping the liquid beneath. Each time they broke through the hardened crust, another slow wave of syrup oozed up to take its place. The work was slow, repetitive, and exhausting. Soon, the smell of sugar hung over everything. The air itself felt heavy. Men returned home with their clothes stiff and brown. Their hands stuck to everything they touched. The city began pumping seawater from the harbor to dilute the syrup, using fireboats to spray the area with salt water day and night. Gradually, the streets began to clear, but only in patches. For every foot of progress, another alley or basement was discovered still half full of molasses. Horses and wagons were brought in to haul away the debris, but even that proved difficult. Wheels clogged with syrup. The animals slipped on the slick ground. Tools had to be cleaned constantly, just to remain usable. Each day ended the same way, with boots, shovels, and uniforms soaked in molasses. No one could escape it. It coated doorknobs, handrails, and even the handles of coffee cups. The Boston harbor soon turned brown. The tides carried the diluted syrup out to sea, but for weeks, the water along the docks looked like dark tea. Seagulls avoided the area. Fish floated to the surface. Residents along the waterfront said they could still smell molasses when the wind came from the east. Cleaning crews grew used to the rhythm: scrape, shovel, rinse, repeat. Children watched from the sidewalks as teams of workers chipped hardened syrup off the walls. In some areas, the molasses was several inches thick. It had hardened into a glossy, amber-colored shell that cracked under pressure like glass. When the sun hit it, it shimmered faintly, strangely beautiful, and impossible to remove. Reporters visiting the site described scenes of quiet determination. Men knee-deep in syrup, moving slowly as if through another world. Fireboats spraying arcs of salt water over the ruins. Residents leaning out of upper windows, watching silently as their neighborhood was scraped clean, inch by inch. It took nearly 2 weeks to make the main streets passable again. Smaller lanes and alleys took much longer. Basements had to be pumped out by hand. Some were never fully cleaned. Even after the visible molasses was gone, a fine, sticky film remained on walls and furniture for months. People found it on their shoes, their curtains, even their pets. It clung to everything. For years afterward, Boston carried traces of the flood. On hot summer days, residents claimed they could still smell molasses in the air, rising from the cobblestones as the heat returned to the city. Some said it was imagination. Others said it was memory. Either way, it lingered a faint sweetness that refused to fade. When the last of the bodies had been found and the streets were finally clear enough to walk, Boston began to ask a single question: why did it happen? For the first few days, confusion and rumor filled the silence. Some newspapers speculated that anarchists had planted a bomb. It was an easy story to believe the United States had recently seen a wave of political violence, and fear of radicals was common. The U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company, owner of the destroyed tank, quickly supported that theory. They claimed that saboteurs had attacked their property because of the company's role in producing industrial alcohol for the war. But as investigators arrived and examined the scene, the evidence told a different story. There were no signs of explosives, no scorch marks, no chemical traces of a blast. What they found instead was a pattern of failure rivets torn from their sockets, steel plates bent outward, seams pulled apart by internal pressure. This was not an act of war. It was an act of neglect. City engineers and safety officials began to study the wreckage piece by piece. They took photographs, measured fragments, and interviewed witnesses. Workers spoke of leaks, of groaning sounds, of the dark stains that had appeared for months before the collapse. Residents described how they could see molasses dripping down the tank's sides and how the company had painted it to hide the leaks. Each story added to a picture that was difficult to deny. Public anger grew quickly. Boston's newspapers began publishing editorials demanding accountability. The Boston Globe called the disaster a tragedy of carelessness. Others described it as the result of unchecked corporate greed. For the families of the dead, the explanations from the company talk of anarchists and bad luck sounded like insults. They wanted justice, not excuses. In the weeks that followed, the city launched a formal investigation. Officials gathered testimonies from engineers, laborers, and company executives. The hearings took place in downtown Boston, in a crowded chamber where the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and tobacco smoke. Reporters filled the benches, taking notes as witnesses described the tank's history of leaks and complaints. Each new revelation drew quiet murmurs from the audience. The U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company defended itself fiercely. Its lawyers argued that the disaster was an unforeseeable accident, a force of nature. They insisted the tank had been properly constructed and that no one could have predicted the failure. They even brought in experts to suggest that the explosion might have been caused by fermentation or spontaneous combustion, but the evidence didn't support them. The structure had burst outward, not inward. The cause was internal pressure, not fire. As the inquiry deepened, engineers presented technical analyses that were new to most Americans at the time. They explained how steel behaves under stress, how temperature changes cause expansion and contraction, and how the thin plates of the molasses tank had never been strong enough to hold their intended load. In one demonstration, an investigator showed that the rivets used in the tank were defective, brittle, containing tiny air bubbles that made them prone to cracking. He placed one under a press and broke it with minimal force. The courtroom was silent. For the first time, the public began to understand that this was not simply bad luck. It was a failure of responsibility, a preventable tragedy caused by haste, cost-cutting, and disregard for safety. The same industrial ambition that had driven America's progress had, in this case, turned deadly. Outside the hearings, people gathered on the courthouse steps, waiting for news. Some brought signs demanding that the company pay for its negligence. Others simply wanted the truth. In the North End, the ruined foundations of the tank remained as a reminder of what had happened. Children still played nearby, though parents warned them to stay away. The site smelled faintly of sugar, even as winter turned to spring. The investigation would stretch on for years. It would become one of the longest and most complex civil cases in Massachusetts history. But as the evidence mounted, one conclusion became inescapable. The tank had been doomed from the day it was built. The legal case that followed the Great Molasses Flood became one of the most significant civil trials in early 20th century America. It lasted for over 5 years. Thousands of pages of testimony were recorded. More than 150 witnesses took the stand: engineers, survivors, police officers, and executives from the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company. Each account added another fragment to the slow construction of truth. At the heart of the case was a simple question: had the company acted responsibly? The answer, when it came, was clear. In 1925, the Massachusetts Superior Court found the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company liable for the disaster. The ruling stated that the company had failed to exercise reasonable care in the construction and maintenance of the tank. The evidence showed that it had been built without proper engineering oversight, without adequate testing, and without inspection. Warnings from workers and residents had been ignored. The collapse, the court concluded, was entirely preventable. The company was ordered to pay damages totaling nearly $1 million, the equivalent of more than $15 million in today's currency. The money was distributed among the victims' families and the city of Boston to repair infrastructure. It was, at the time, one of the largest settlements in U.S. history. But for those who had lost loved ones, the compensation could never replace what was gone. The verdict carried consequences beyond Boston. It marked a turning point in American industry, a shift toward accountability and regulation. Before the flood, companies often built as they pleased, with little government oversight. There were few laws requiring structural inspections and none enforcing independent verification by engineers. After the disaster, that began to change. Municipal governments across the United States introduced new building codes and safety standards. Tanks, boilers, and storage facilities would now require certification by licensed engineers. The principles of design, review, and public safety ideas that today seem obvious were, in part, shaped by this tragedy. The molasses flood had become an unlikely catalyst for reform. For engineers, the case became a study in materials failure. Experts analyzed the brittle steel, the flawed rivets, the stresses caused by temperature change. In universities, it was used as an example of what happens when business decisions override technical judgment. It was, as one professor wrote years later, a lesson in arrogance disguised as an accident. The U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company survived the verdict. It paid the damages and continued operating for several decades, though its reputation never fully recovered. The Purity Distilling name quietly disappeared from the harbor. The site where the tank once stood was eventually cleared and redeveloped, its violent history fading beneath new buildings and new memories. Yet, in Boston, the story remained. For the residents of the North End, the flood was more than an industrial failure, it was part of the city's collective memory. Parents told their children about the day the streets ran brown. Old-timers said that in the summer heat, when the sun struck the cobblestones, you could still smell molasses in the air. The verdict had brought justice, at least on paper. But what it truly delivered was awareness, that progress carries risk, and that the cost of neglect can outlast any profit. As the years passed, the Great Molasses Flood slowly faded from national memory. Outside Boston, few spoke of it. Even within the city, it became something half-remembered, a story told by older residents to their grandchildren, often met with disbelief. A flood of molasses? People would laugh. It sounded like exaggeration, like a fable, not a real event that had taken lives and reshaped a neighborhood. By the 1,930 the world had moved on. The Great Depression gripped the country, and new struggles occupied the public's attention. Factories closed, families lost their homes, and Boston, like many cities, focused on survival. The ruins of the molasses tank were long gone. The site had been cleared, paved over, and rebuilt. A municipal yard and later a park occupied the space. Only the oldest residents could still point to the exact spot where the tank had stood. Time has a way of sanding down the rough edges of tragedy. The sharpness dulls, the urgency fades. Even the smell disappeared. By the mid-century, the North End was changing again, immigrants giving way to new generations, narrow streets filled with restaurants, shops, and tourists. To most people, the story of the flood was little more than a local curiosity, a strange anecdote tucked into the city's history books. Occasionally, the event resurfaced in small ways. A short article would appear in a newspaper on its anniversary. A local historian might give a talk at a library. But beyond that, silence. There were no monuments, no plaques, no official recognition. Boston remembered the Tea Party, the Revolution, the fires, but not the molasses. Those who did remember spoke of it quietly. They described how the streets had once glistened brown under the winter sun, how the smell had filled the air for weeks, how neighbors had helped one another through the wreckage. For them, it was not a joke or a curiosity. It was a moment of loss, one more reminder of how fragile daily life could be. The children who had survived grew old, their memories blurred. Some left the city, others stayed and watched their neighborhood change around them. By the time the Second World War began, the flood was 2 decades in the past, distant enough to feel like another era entirely. And so the story drifted, quietly, into obscurity. No major books were written about it. No films, no memorials, no national recognition. Even in Boston, it was something you had to already know to find. The molasses flood became, in a sense, invisible, covered not by syrup this time, but by time itself. For half a century, the Great Molasses Flood existed mostly in the margins of Boston's history, a strange footnote, an urban legend whispered among locals. Then, slowly, it began to return. In the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, historians and journalists started to look again at the old records, the photographs, the court documents, the newspaper reports long buried in archives. What they found astonished them. The disaster that had once been dismissed as a curiosity was, in truth, a window into an entire era of American industry, a moment when ambition had outpaced caution. The trial transcripts alone filled thousands of pages, a detailed record of early 20th century life, the technology, the labor practices, the attitudes toward safety and progress. Historians realized that this was more than a local tragedy. It was a story about how a nation learned slowly and painfully to take responsibility for the things it built. Local researchers began publishing new accounts, reconstructing the event from eyewitness testimony and technical evidence. Engineers revisited the design of the tank, analyzing the steel composition and the failure patterns. They found that the metal had been far too brittle for the cold January weather, and that the rivets used to hold the plates together had been improperly forged. The tank had not been doomed by sabotage or fate, but by physics, by the predictable limits of material and pressure. In 2014, a team of scientists from Harvard University and the University of Massachusetts applied modern fluid dynamics modeling to the disaster. Using computer simulations, they recreated the flow of molasses through the north end. Their research confirmed what witnesses had described. The wave had moved at about 35 miles per hour, and its density had made it more destructive than water. The team even demonstrated that molasses, once cooled, solidifies, quickly explaining why victims had been unable to move or breathe once trapped. For the first time, science provided a full, clear picture of how the event unfolded. Museums began to take notice. Small exhibits appeared in Boston, displaying photographs, court sketches, and fragments of the original tank. Local schools added the story to their history programs. Documentaries featured the event as one of the most unusual industrial accidents in American history. It was no longer a joke or an odd headline. It was evidence, a cautionary tale about the consequences of cutting corners. In 2019, a century after the disaster, the city of Boston finally marked the site with an official plaque. It stands today along Commercial Street, near the modern Coast Guard facility, quietly facing the harbor. The plaque is modest, a few lines of text, a brief summary of what happened. Most who pass by might not notice it at all, but for those who stop, the simplicity is striking. A small reminder of a forgotten flood returned to memory. Researchers continue to study the event not just for its engineering lessons, but for its human ones. They examine how cities respond to disaster, how communities rebuild, and how stories fade from collective consciousness. The Molasses Flood has become a case study in the psychology of memory, how something so massive can disappear from national awareness, and how rediscovery can bring it back, one voice at a time. Today, the North End is one of Boston's most visited neighborhoods. Tourists fill its narrow streets, eating in cafes and walking along the harbor. Few realize that 100 years earlier, those same streets were filled with syrup. Yet, if you listen carefully, local guides still tell the story calmly, almost reverently. And sometimes, when the summer heat rises from the pavement, they still repeat the old line. You can smell the molasses when the sun is warm enough. The Great Molasses Flood is, in many ways, a small story. It did not reshape nations or end wars. It did not appear in textbooks beside the great battles and inventions of its time. It was, instead, an ordinary failure, a tank built too quickly, ignored too long, and remembered too little. And yet, within that small story, there is something larger, a reminder of how fragile progress can be. The flood was a product of its age, an age of confidence, of growth, of faith in human ingenuity. America in 1919 believed that anything could be built if the will and money were there. Factories rose overnight, bridges stretched across rivers, and cities reached higher each year. It was a time when speed mattered more than care, and ambition often replaced patience. The molasses tank was born in that spirit, and when it failed, it revealed the hidden cost of that confidence. Every piece of metal, every rivet, every decision made without thought for safety, all of it became part of the chain that led to disaster. It is easy, looking back, to see where things went wrong. It is harder to remember that progress has always carried risk and that responsibility is rarely shared evenly. What remains today is not the tank, or the ruins, or even the smell that once filled the air. What remains is the lesson that what we build and how we build it matters. That a structure's strength is not just in its materials, but in the care of those who create it, and that the smallest neglect can, under pressure, become catastrophe. In Boston's North End, the site of the flood is quiet now. The streets are clean, the harbor calm. Where the great steel tank once stood, there is a park with trees and benches. Children play there again, as they did more than a century ago. They run and shout, their voices echoing off the brick buildings, unaware of the history beneath their feet. If you stand there long enough, you can hear the same distant sounds, the gulls, the waves, the low hum of the city, and you can almost imagine that day returning, just for a moment. The Great Molasses Flood will never be as famous as other disasters, but perhaps that is fitting. It was not a story of heroes or villains, only of people, workers, families, engineers, rescuers, caught between progress and its price. Their names are mostly forgotten, but the traces of what they endured remain in the archives, the court records, and the quiet streets that have long since dried. History rarely shouts. More often, it whispers through documents, through photographs, through the faint scent of sugar on a warm summer day. And if we listen carefully, the story of the molasses flood still speaks, not of sweetness or tragedy, but of the delicate balance between human ambition and human care.